Welcome everyone to GME Grand Rounds for today. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Stephanie Holm. She is an environmental pediatrician and epidemiologist. She's the director of the Western States Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit. I believe she co-directs that with somebody. She does research on air pollution effects on children's health and works half-time at California EPA in the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. And today, Dr. Holm is going to be talking to us about environmental exposures in kids and using wildfire smoke as an example. Thank you so much, Dr. Holm, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you for the intro. Give me 1 second. All right. Whoop. You guys should see my slides now, correct?
Yes, that looks great.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks everybody for being here. And thank you for the introduction, Christina. Nice to meet everybody. I have my usual slide about not having any disclosures. Give me 1 second. Christina and I were just laughing about, you'd think at this point Zoom would be like super smooth, but there's always something. All right. And then this is just my slide to say that I'm lucky enough to get funding from a number of folks, AAP, CDC, ATSDR, EPA, but that my comments are my own and not official stances of any of the various organizations that I work for and or am paid by. All right. So our outline for today, we're going to start by just doing a little bit of scope of the issue about wildfire smoke, talk about effects of wildfire disasters more broadly on health, talk briefly about the health effects of wildfire smoke in adults, and then do our shift to kids and talk about why children are more vulnerable to environmental exposures broadly, including to wildfire smoke, and then talk about what we know about the health effects of wildfire smoke in children and various public health considerations and responses for responding to wildfire smoke. And then if we have time at the end, I've got balancing wildfire smoke with other issues, a couple slides at the end that we can do if we get there or if someone has questions. All right, so as folks that live in California, many of you are probably, if not all of you, are very familiar with this, but wildfire smoke can really expose very large populations to smoke, even from a single event. This image on the left is from October of 2020, when there were multiple lightning strikes that had occurred and created the August complex. So it had been August, but this picture is now by October. And you can see that, in this case, there were a handful of fires, but that really most of the state is blanketed in smoke from these fires. And so even folks who really weren't particularly close to any single wildfire event were still being affected by the wildfire smoke. The pictures on the right are actually very close to the same time frame. Those are pictures that I took, just giving a sense of, the change in visibility with increasing AQI, that's air quality index values. So the picture at the top is an AQI of 20, that's in the green or good range. The next one is 76, that's in the moderate range. I don't have an unhealthy for sensitive group one because that's a tough range to snag a picture in. But then unhealthy and very unhealthy. And these are all like the same time of day on different days. It's a nice, visual of just how much here in the Bay Area we were affected by wildfire smoke during that time, even though the events were quite a ways away from us. So I often like to use this slide about increasing mega wildfires in California. So this graph is looking at annual acres burned by the 20 largest wildfires in California history. And so if you plot those out, nearly all of those acres are in the last 20 years. And with, pretty impressive increase over time in the acres from large wildfires. When I first started giving these talks after the 2019 fire season, this is what that graph looked like, with the 2018 year being really impressive, right? And folks were always like, wow, that's so big. What do you think is going to happen? I update this graph every time, every fire season, basically, before I start for the year. And so this is it now. So that 2018 bar that was so impressive when I first started giving lectures is like completely dwarfed now by the 2020 and 2021 fire seasons. And I think it's just, you know, an even more impressive visual of just how much these mega fires are increasing. The reason I say that specifically is that, again, this is just looking at the acres from the 20 largest fires. So it's not looking at overall acreage. I think oftentimes folks mistakenly think that this is, you know, very much a California issue. And so even though I was presenting California data a minute ago, because we're all here, I also wanted to just show this graph, or I mean, this map. So this is from NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And these are estimates for weeks with very large fires in the mid 21st century compared to the end of the 20th. And what you're looking at here is areas that are darker red have a larger increase in the risk of in the weeks of high fire risk in the next 50 years or so compared to 20 years ago. And what you can see is, you know, there are a lot of regions across the US where the fire risk is going to be increasing. And basically everywhere is downwind from at least one of these areas, right? But also that some of the areas that are expected to see the largest increase are actually not the sort of traditional wildfire areas that folks think about, right? You know, North and South Dakota, for example, is not like the first place that pops to my head when you say wildfires, nor is Louisiana, right? And there's some pretty impressive increases in those places as well. And so I think it's something to be aware of, you know, regardless of where patients or family members or, you know, whoever you might have in your head when you're thinking about wildfire smoke, regardless of where those folks are located, it's likely that wildfire smoke is going to be an increasing issue as we continue to move forward. So what is wildfire smoke? You may know this, so apologies if this feels basic, but I always like to start with some just you know, general info for folks. So wildfire smoke is mostly what's called particulate matter. Particulate matter just means basically microscopic dust, right? It's defined by size. And so there's a whole bunch of different things that fit into the particulate matter. I'm going to call it a bin. And this diagram is sort of a classic one that the EPA uses to show just how small we're talking about. So that large columnar looking thing in the middle is supposed to represent an average single human hair. And then if we're talking about PM10, that's particles that are less than 10 microns in diameter. Those are small enough that 5 of those fit across a human hair, roughly. And then PM2.5, 2.5 microns in diameter or smaller, 20 of those fit across the width of a human hair, right? So we're talking about really, really small stuff. And particulate matter is produced from a variety of sources. Traffic, for example, is one of the large, frequent sources of particulate matter. Certainly if you live near, go to school near, work near a freeway, right? That's going to be a large portion of exposure. But some studies have shown that actually in some part of the US, up to half of the outdoor particulate matter in a year is coming from wildfire smoke at this point. And as I said, that's likely to increase, right? As these mega fires continue to increase. In terms of other stuff that's contained in wildfire smoke, this is where we get into a little bit of hand waving. And the reason for that is it's really variable. So there's a lot of stuff in wildfire smoke. It's a really heterogeneous mixture of a variety of things. And part of the problem is that the composition really varies depending on not only what is burning, right? Like, is it trees versus cars, as are in the picture, versus buildings versus, you know, other kinds of material, as well as both the transport conditions, right? Like, is it windy today? Is it humid? All of these things can play a role in, you know, either what's produced or how far the various components of the smoke travel after being produced, how much they break down and interact with other things in the air. Definitely when human structures and, you know, objects burn, you can release a variety of chemicals, including things like flame retardants and volatile organic compounds. A whole variety of different pollutants like nitrogen oxides, ozone, PAHs, all kinds of things can be released. One thing that's, I think, good to know from a clinician point of view is that in general, and again, this is a little hand wavy, but in general, most of those things don't travel as far. So when you're thinking about like the image that I showed early on, where we were talking about wildfire smoke reaching the Bay Area from events that are quite far away, that's almost entirely particulate matter. If you're very close, right, you're fleeing a fire down the street, then it's much more likely that you're getting exposure to this larger mix of things. There's been some interesting recent evidence looking at various components of wildfire smoke. So for example, CARB, which is the California Air Resources Board, published an analysis last year, I think, looking at the 2018 Camp Fire. And they actually found that lead, like airborne lead levels, there was a spike in airborne lead all the way down in San Jose during the time of the fire. And that's, it's an interesting thing to think about because there are a number of pollutants that have really decreased over the time, right? Over time, when unleaded gasoline became a thing in the 70s, right? Our airborne lead concentrations went down quite a bit. And so it's really interesting to think about the fact that, these individual wildfire events may increase exposure to pollutants that we'd previously been less worried about because we really decreased the exposures. So most of what I'm going to talk about focuses on particulate matter. That's for a couple of reasons. One, it's more consistent, right? Like it's present in basically all wildfire smoke, whereas a lot of these other things are different levels at different times and really hard to measure. And B, it's just the most well studied. So there's more info to tell you about those. All right, so before we move to wildfire smoke, I like to start with just a general, let's think about wildfire health effects broadly, like what are the effects of the actual wildfire event? Because I think it's easy to focus on the smoke and kind of forget about these things as well. So wildfire smoke events in the US cause more than 3,000 deaths per year and more than 15,000 burns or other injuries. There's also substantial mental health effects, particularly in folks that need to be evacuated, are directly affected by by wildfire events. And, like with just about anything, there's good data that these effects are worst in the folks that have more stressors at baseline, which is tough, right? Because we're then impacting the most vulnerable people even more. And just to remember that displacement can have a variety of downstream health effects, right? So I've listed here exacerbation of underlying health conditions, either because, meds aren't as available or you're exposed to new triggers when you're not in your, space that you've been able to control, et cetera. And that displacement is particularly tough for folks with limited means. And so that can spiral and have additional health effects. Okay. So we're going to take our pivot to wildfire smoke now, rather than talking about the wildfires themselves. In adults, there's really consistent, robust evidence of relationships between respiratory illnesses, respiratory hospitalizations, respiratory clinic visits, and wildfire smoke. And that makes sense, right? When wildfire smoke exposure goes up, a variety of breathing problems get worse and people seek care. There's also consistent relationships with non-traumatic mortality, especially respiratory mortality, which again fits with that, but also just other kinds of non-traumatic mortality also increase following exposure to wildfire smoke. There's quite a bit more inconsistency in the findings regarding cardiovascular outcomes. There's certainly enough to be concerned. There are multiple studies that have shown increases in things like myocardial infarctions, following wildfire smoke events or wildfire smoke exposures. But those data are a bit more mixed than the data for respiratory symptoms and care for respiratory illnesses. So knowing that, I always like to say, kids often, there's often less data for kids. We often have fewer studies. And so thinking about what we know for adults as a starting point for our base of knowledge for kids is a really good way to go. And so, we would expect that you would see sort of similar things, similar kinds of effects, respiratory effects being a large one, in children as you see in adults. I think one of the things I often like to talk about, especially when there's, a lot of folks that take care of adults on one of my talks, is that you really need to think about how kids are different sort of in a larger sense. So this is sort of the classic, adage that pediatricians always share, right? Which is that children are not small adults. But they're also not aliens, right? They're still human. And I think sometimes adult folks get nervous about thinking about kids because maybe we've done too good of a job of reminding everyone that they're not small adults. And so a lot of what you know applies with a few key differences. And so I wanted to go over those differences because I think that's a helpful framework for thinking about environmental health in kids and how environmental exposures can affect kids more broadly. So why are kids more vulnerable, susceptible and vulnerable to environmental exposures compared to adults? So the first reason is that they have differences in their physiology that increase the effective dose that they get. So for the wildfire smoke example, kids have a higher minute ventilation per kilo than adults do. And so if you think about it in terms of like how much air you're taking in compared to your body's ability to, to detoxify, deal with oxidative stress, et cetera, kids are getting a larger effective dose than adults are. The second is that they have unique windows of growth and development, right? So I often poke fun at myself and say that, we adults don't change that much unless there happens to be a global pandemic and then maybe my waistline changes, but other things don't change that much, right? But if you look at my daughter, who over the course of the last few years has gone from being, a tiny little kindergartner to this big, spindly 9-year-old third grader now, kids change a lot. And so if you perturb a growing and changing system, you can have sort of these big downstream long-term effects because you're affecting not just air quotes a static system, but one that's changing and growing. And so if you disrupt that pattern of growth, change the growth trajectory, you can really have long-term effects. And then the third is that kids have behaviors and preferences that increase their exposure to environmental contaminants. There are lots of examples of this. So for things like lead that we were talking about before, it's heavy. So airborne lead actually is concentrated low down to the ground. So the fact that you have kids sitting on the ground more, playing on the ground more, will mean that they'll get a higher exposure. For wildfire smoke, kids in general spend more time outdoors and more time active than adults do. That's a good thing overall, right? We want them running around and playing outside. It would be better if I was running around and playing outside more than I am. But that does also mean that they are likely to be exposed to more wildfire smoke. So as you think about kids generally, if you're able to think about these three things as why they're particularly vulnerable to any environmental exposure, but including wildfire smoke, it's a really good framework for you. So I'll just repeat them one more time, which is that kids have differences in their physiology that increase their dose. They've got unique windows of growth and development. And then they've got behaviors and preferences that actually increase their exposures. All right, so what do we know? I talked to you already about what we know from adult studies looking at wildfire smoke pollution and adult health outcomes. What do we know from other research in air pollution, right? Sort of more broadly, not just wildfire smoke, but PM 2.5 exposures from traffic and from other sources. So we know that there's really strong relationships with respiratory illnesses in kids, with metabolism and growth. So things like increasing obesity associated with long-term PM 2.5 exposure, neurocognitive effects. So this can be a variety of things like changes in IQ, as well as learning differences. And then there are carcinogenic effects as well. PM 2.5 actually is an IARC, that's International Agency for Research on Cancer, an IARC classified carcinogen known to cause cancer. And so those four categories are all really well established from other air pollution work. When you look at the literature for wildfire smoke specifically in kids, there's a lot fewer studies, but we have some. And what we have shows that there are well-documented upper respiratory effects associated with wildfire smoke. I'm assuming that's a surprise to no one, because if you've lived in an area with wildfire smoke, you've probably experienced that, you and or your kids, neighbors' kids, whatever kids you happen to know. There's also good data showing that there are increases in asthma exacerbations for kids associated with wildfire smoke. And that's been well enough studied that there's starting to be more work looking at sort of, particularly vulnerable subgroups. So kids that are higher BMI seem to be particularly vulnerable to these wildfire smoke effects. The younger kids, including some of the ones that we might not necessarily call asthma, sort of our, young toddler wheezers. And there was also a recent study that found in Southern California, I think, that indigenous populations were particularly vulnerable. Also good evidence for lower respiratory infections, things like pneumonias, bronchitises, and then similar to the adult literature, some data on visits for various respiratory conditions, ER visits, clinic visits, especially in younger kids. And there was a study in 2020 showing that actually wildfire PM seemed to be more strongly related to respiratory care, needing respiratory care in kids than just sort of general PM, right? The general bucket that comes from all sources. And then I always think this is cool. There's a student that I know who was a UCSF or is a UCSF UC Berkeley Joint Medical Program student who published a paper a couple years ago looking at atopic dermatitis and the fact that UCSF atopic dermatitis visits increase for kids during wildfire smoke events. What do we know about effects from exposure either preconception or in utero? There's really robust data that birth weight decreases with exposure to wildfire smoke. That's been seen during various times in pregnancy, but the data seems strongest for late in pregnancy. So later pregnancy, wildfire smoke exposure, there tends to be a decrease in birth weight, as well as an increase in preterm birth. There's also some evidence that there may be increases in gastroschisis, abdominal wall defects, and that's for early exposure, which I think is sort of fascinating. That's definitely a newer finding and just one study, but I think something worth keeping an eye on. But certainly the birth weight and preterm birth effects are relatively robust. And then this is from a Lancet Planetary Health article that was published last year. It's a map showing child mortality worldwide related to PM 2.5 from wildfire smoke. It's slightly complicated. This map's trying to show two different things simultaneously. So the colors are looking at the proportion of child mortality in a country that's due to fire-sourced PM 2.5. And then the circles are showing the number of child deaths. So if you see an area like the Democratic Republic of the Congo that is both dark colored and has a big circle, it's showing you that there's both a large number of pediatric deaths related to wildfire smoke there, and that makes up a large proportion of their pediatric deaths. This is just from the last couple of years, and I think I at least previously have made the error of thinking that kids having wildfire smoke contribute to their death is not something that is happening in our world today, but it is, right, to quite a large extent. And certainly there are a number of places that are really highly affected. They've highlighted on this map 5 that have particularly high numbers of deaths. But even in the US, that's not zero, right? We still have quite a number of kids who die every year with some contribution from PM 2.5 from wildfire smoke. All right, that was a heavy note. So we're going to take a breath and we're going to talk about public health responses and messaging and what we can do both for ourselves and for patients to really try and, improve that situation, right? Try and make sure that we're decreasing exposures for kids. And if and when kids are exposed, figure out how we can improve their health. Just really quickly showing, there's a wildfire guide group that is led by the federal EPA and includes stakeholders from a variety of different organizations that works together to make wildfire smoke recommendations, and historically hasn't had a lot of stuff for children. But last year, we and they and a variety of other folks worked together on a workshop for wildfire smoke and children's health, brought together a whole bunch of folks and had some work groups that made recommendations for unified public health messaging, right? To try and make it so that, you know, at California state level and your county level and your city, and right, to try and give all of those folks a base of scientific understanding so that we can all everyone can be sharing the same messages rather than having conflicting stuff happening. If you ever like to see what those messages are, you're totally welcome to look. It's publicly available. I put a little QR code on the right there, so you can go directly to it. If you search for EPA wildfire guide page, you should also be able to get there. But I find their webpage slightly convoluted sometimes. So the QR is there if you'd like it. And this is just what that report looks like. It's got sections on mask and respirator use. It's got sections on school indoor air quality. It's got sections on using air sensors to understand air quality, and then recommendations for physical activity during wildfire smoke. And I'm actually going to go through essentially all of these recommendations with you today. If we make it there in time, we'll see how we're doing. We'll sample at least some of them. All right, so I mentioned this briefly already, but just to kind of recap as we go into the public health messaging standpoint of things, the air quality index is what's used by the federal EPA to communicate with the public about air pollution and what people's exposure levels are. For each pollutant, they have this same scale. So for PM 2.5, for ozone, there are a number of different pollutants. And the idea is that this is tied to health outcomes, so that any AQI values below 100, you're not expecting to see health effects, at least in the short term. That once you get above 100, sensitive groups may experience health effects, and so on and so forth, right? The higher you go, the more people and the more severe health effects you would expect. Just so that you know, the EPA does these major reviews of the science every few years, looking at literally everything that's been published on a particular pollutant and its health effects. And they use that to set what are called the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And those standards are actually what's behind this AQI. I like to say that just because I think sometimes people are like, well, this feels a little wishy-washy, like where does this even come from? But that's where it is. So that we have an annual air quality standard, and that's the dividing line between green and yellow. And we have a short term, a 24-hour air quality standard in this country, and that's the dividing line between yellow and orange. So, those are really well supported by a whole big evidence base, and reviewed and, updated when they need to be. So if you want to know where to find your air quality information in your local area, this is sort of the most simple place to direct somebody. So like when my great auntie recently was asking me, like, this is what I sent her to. I wanted just something that would give her like a, simple, straight answer. This is airnow.gov. You can see I'm showing San Francisco. I can't remember when this was, October of last year. And it gives you this sort of odometer style that shows you the current air quality, gives you a reminder of sort of, where that color code sits within the rest of the odometer, gives you a forecast at the bottom for today's air quality versus tomorrow's air quality. And there's also a little legend over here on the side if you wanted to, remind yourself about those categories. So this is, you put in your zip code and it sort of gives you one answer. Oftentimes, though, people would like more granular information. And so if you yourselves or, you're giving advice to someone who's more comfortable looking at data, this map, which is fire.airnow.gov, is pretty cool because it combines multiple sources of information. So that page I was showing you before uses the EPA's regulatory monitors, right? These are the like gold standard, really expensive, set up in a big monitoring station, air pollution monitors. And so they give really good data, but there aren't very many of them, right? And more, there are these lower cost sensors that people are using and trying to get better spatial resolution of data where they live. So what's cool about this map is it combines on here both the EPA monitors, that's these circles, and then these little squares are low cost monitors. These ones happen to be purple air monitors that are out in the community, and that's just being pulled into this same map. And so you can see, these are gold standard. That those values are right, air quotes, right? But you can get a sense from all of the details here from the purple air monitors, you can get a better sense of the spatial distribution of sort of where the air pollution is getting bad, right? So if you happen to live in Chico last July when I took this snapshot, and you were trying to decide, do I take my kids to the park over here on the west side of town or to the park on the east side of town? You can see that there's this spatial distribution, right? There's a difference in the air quality levels. It also shows you where the smoke plume is. So this darker area is showing that there's a smoke plume over that area. If you click on one of the individual sensors here, so this one, for example, I clicked on in the middle, it shows you a lot of that same information we looked at on the main Air Now page. So it gives you the color code for this sensor, but it also gives you some cool things. So it gives you a trend, and it shows you what's happening at that sensor kind of right now for various reasons. And I'm happy to chat more about it if somebody's curious. The EPA uses a multiple hour averaging time for calculating the air quality levels. That's useful because it gets rid of a lot of noise, right? But it does mean that if conditions are changing really quickly, it doesn't always reflect that on their tools or on their maps. So this is a way to see what's happening quickly. So, this monitor, right now when I took this, was orange in the unhealthy for sensitive groups range. But the trend was that it was going towards the unhealthy range. It was getting worse, right? So that can be really useful for helping make decisions too. Do I go for my run now or do I wait, right? If you see that conditions are worsening or getting better, it can help you make better decisions. I often get asked, this is the fire.airnow.gov map, and I said it uses purple air sensors. Why can't you just go on the purple air map? You can. I'd suggest pointing people to the fire.airnow.gov map for a couple of reasons. One is that it incorporates those other sources of information. The second is that the purple air map doesn't default to the best correction values available. You can force it, so you can change it to the EPA correction, but that doesn't happen automatically. Their map has less quality assurance, so there's a fair bit of QA that happens for stuff that go up to the fire.airnow.gov map. And sensors will get dropped if it looks like they're not behaving. And the colors here are less perceptually uniform. So this is actually at the exact same time as I took this one. And if you look, Chico, right, most of these are green and then yellow. But when you look on the purple air map, they try and do a continuous color scale. And so even though these 42 and 46 are still within the green zone, depends on your color perception, I suppose, but these look pretty yellow to me rather than green. So, that tool's there, but I'd really recommend the fire.airnow.gov map instead. So the other thing people often ask is, well, okay, so you pointed out that this map has some of the purple air sensors, like how do we know which low-cost sensors are precise? How do we figure out if my patient wants to buy one, if my mom wants to buy one, right? How do I know what good ones are? And I'll just say I don't have any relationships with any companies. So these are two examples of ones that I have purchased for myself. But the reason that I've used those ones is that AQ-SPEC, which is the Air Quality Sensor Performance Evaluation Center, it's run out of the South Coast Air Management District down in Los Angeles. They evaluate low-cost sensors, and they make those evaluations publicly available. They have really good data on their webpage, and so you can look and see which ones have been performing well. So they've got these enclosures that they put outside, put a whole bunch of sensors in there, and put it next to one of those gold standard EPA monitors to be able to assess, how accurate they are, how precise they are, what the response time is, how well they track up and down as the pollution levels go up and down. They then report out the details of how well the sensor correlates with the gold standard pollutant values. So these are, I haven't updated this in a little while. Apologies, I will do that again soon. But this was as of about a year ago, the ones on AQ-SPEC that had a field R-squared, right? So how well the sensor tracked with the gold standard when it was out in sort of somewhat real world conditions. a field R squared of 0.85 or higher, meaning it's capturing 85% of the variance or higher. So these are ones that did for at least one of the PM fractions, but you can see that some of them are great for some PM fractions and terrible for others. So this first one here, for example, the PM1, the smallest PM, is capturing pretty well, right? The R squared is 0.86 to 0.88, but the PM10 is pretty terrible. The sensor's picking up 10% of the variance in the pollutant levels that the gold standard one is picking up. But so it's kind of nice. You can look at these and see what the options are in terms of price and how well the various sensors perform compared to different size fractions of particulate matter. Purple air is one of the older ones, so that's why right now EPA has made a correction factor for that device. I would imagine that there will probably be more coming for other devices soon. One thing to remember, though, is that this R squared really tells you about precision, right? It tells you about how well this device tracks with the gold standard. It does not tell you anything about accuracy. So it doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, a 10 on an Atmotube Pro or a 10 on a Purple Air is the exact same as a 10 from the EPA monitor, just that they go up and down as you would expect with the gold standard monitor. And so that's why those correction factors are really useful. Or just knowing, right, in terms of how you interpret things, if you're using, for example, Atmotube is a little portable monitor. If you're using it to compare inside versus outside, right, and you're like, oh, I can tell that now my inside is better than outside, that's a totally useful way to do it, right? But you're not necessarily trusting the exact number. All right. So we've talked about how to find out what the pollution is like. Let's talk a little bit about what determines how much of outside particulate matter comes indoors. There are three main ways that outside PM comes inside. One is infiltration, right? So it comes in sort of through the building envelope, the leaky bits in your building. One is natural ventilation, that's opening windows and doors. And then the third is mechanical ventilation. If you have an HVAC system, right, you'll be pulling air in that way. And sometimes people's gut reaction to wildfire smoke events is just like, you know, if I could magically shrink wrap my house and we'll just all stay inside, it'll all be fine, right? It won't come in and then that's great. Well, the problem is if you stop all of those different kinds of airflow, you'll actually have other problems, issues with pollution that's made indoors. Basically, anytime we burn anything, right, whether that's candles, food, heating sources, right, all of those produce pollutants indoors. A variety of other chemicals and you know, cleaning chemicals, all sorts of things also produce indoor pollution. And you can also have moisture and mold problems if you're really stopping the ventilation. So the key thing is to really make sure you're filtering the air and filtering as much of the air coming in as possible. You have central air. That means picking a filter that's rated MERV 13, M-E-R-V. That's minimum efficiency rating value, 13 or higher. There are various sort of proprietary company rating systems that aren't consistent. So what you want to look for is that MERV rating. Or if you're using a portable air filter, to have one that has a high enough clean air delivery rate for your space. And I'll show those again in a minute, show you some resources for looking at those. So just a reminder, the difference between ventilation and filtration. Ventilation, as we said, is moving air. Filtering is actually running it through a filter and cleaning up the air that is there. Both have been shown to have improvements in health effects for kids. In schools, for example, improvements in ventilation is associated with decreased absences and improved performance on some standardized testing. Filtration has also been associated with higher standardized testing and improvements in asthma symptoms. Both can help during wildfire smoke events. Obviously, what's going to help the most is a combo, right? If you've got ventilation plus filtration, that's going to be your best bet. And I think one thing that this study that I'm describing on the top left here is out of Lawrence Berkeley Lab. And one of the cool things that they showed is that one thing that really makes a big difference is running your HVAC system continuously. People forget that, you know, in addition to just having it on or off, you can have it as sort of a intermittent, it runs a little bit of the time versus running continuously. And if you've got a filter in there and you're running it continuously, that actually means that way more of the air coming in is being filtered. And so that can make a huge difference. So their model showed that for, I think these were a mix of schools and businesses, when those buildings had a MERV 12 filter and were running the HVAC continuously, it decreased the indoor pollutant concentrations by about 62%. So substantial decrease. All right, so this is the summary. If you want to burn that into your brain, if you're using HVAC, you want a MERV 13 filter or higher. If you're looking for a portable air cleaner, you want to make sure that it's a mechanical one, like has a physical filter, and not one using ions or marketed as like electronic filters. The reason for that is that, one, many of those ionic ones produce ozone, which is in and of itself a pollutant. So you're trading one pollutant for another, not the best strategy. And B, the ions it produces have actually been shown to have some cardiorespiratory effects as well. And so rather than, be creating something that may also have downstream health effects, you can use mechanical filters that work better. You want to make sure that you have 2 or more air changes per hour. That means literally like calculating out the volume of your room and seeing how much air the filter can move in an hour. And there's been a lot of interest in the last few years about these DIY air cleaners, either for pandemic and or for wildfire smoke. They can be really useful. I generally say to folks that if they're able to afford a portable air filter that's a manufactured product, I would suggest going that way, just because you expect that those kinds of things would have a longer lifetime. There's good data that the DIY air cleaners can decrease the pollutant levels. There's not a whole lot of data on how long these things continue to be effective for, and what the ongoing costs are as you're having to replace filters. But if you don't have access to a portable air cleaner for whatever reason, these DIY air cleaners can work. They can decrease pollutant levels. You want to make sure that you're using a fan that's from 2012 or later. So, don't go into grandma's basement and pull out the old fan. The reason for that is that the more modern ones have a fuse that'll trip if they overheat. And so just in case there were to be an overheating issue with these filters, since you've got increased air resistance, you wouldn't want to start a fire, right? Have it actually be a fire hazard itself. So you want a 2012 or later fan, box fan, and then you can use 1 or more MERV 13 filters. There are a few different configurations and ways people can set these up. The QR code on the right is linking to a new-ish EPA page that has different designs of how you could make a DIY air cleaner with a single MERV 13 filter, how you can do one with 2 filters, how you can do one with 4 filters, etc. The more filters you can do, the more efficient and better it works at cleaning your air, but it's also more expensive, right? So it's sort of that balance. I also always like to point out that if folks don't have an ability to clean their air at home, there are cleaner air shelters. The state doesn't have a great way right now of finding them. I wish there was a better organized way. I'm hopeful. California Air Resources Board has a pilot program working on clean air shelters through a 2019 bill. And I'm hopeful that they will put together some sort of, easy to search map or resource. But for now, if you have a patient or a family that, needs to get to cleaner air and doesn't have the ability to make a cleaner space at home, the best ways to look for that are either to check local news sources. So here's, at the bottom, an example of Oakland opening up some clean air centers during one of the wildfire smoke events a couple of years ago. But also to know what air district you live in. Each air basin in California has a different air district. We here in the Bay are in the San Francisco Bay Area Air Quality Management District. Sometimes people abbreviate BACMED, BAAQMD. And the webpage for the air districts usually will also have information on clean air shelters. So if you haven't been able to find something in the local news, that's a good place to point people towards as well. All right, I am short on time, so I'm going to give you just a real brief tour of info about masks and respirators, and then I'll pause and take questions. I can also stay a little after the hour if people want to chat and have questions. There's, 7 of us on the call, so we can talk. There's a National Academies Committee that I was on the last couple of years looking at respiratory protection for workers and the public. And I was included on the committee to talk about children's issues. Funny enough, it was actually started before the pandemic. But that certainly, in addition to the wildfire smoke issues, brought the use of respirators and masks really to the forefront of lots of people's minds. That committee made recommendations to the federal government about how to improve the structure for respirators nationwide and how to get them to people and get better information to people, including for children. The hope is that, this will lead to some new devices and better coordination of messaging and increased research on use of respirators. And one sort of exciting update is that just as of the last couple of weeks, ASTM, which is, I think they used to be called American Standards, can't remember. It's now ASTM International. It doesn't officially stand for anything, but they're the group that makes consensus standards for a variety of things like, personal protective equipment, but also a variety of different products. And there's never been a mask or respirator standard for children, and they're currently working on one. So that's exciting, and hopefully there will be more info about that soon. When you're thinking about mask and respirator use for wildfire smoke, you really need to think about two things, which is the filtration, how much of the material comes through the material, how much of the PM comes through the material, and then leakage, how many of the particles can pass around the mask or respirator. I'm going to jump a couple slides and just say that if you look at the data that we have for the general public, and this includes for older children, there's a real difference in how much decrease in particulate matter you would expect from a medical mask compared to a NIOSH N95 respirator. So you would expect that a surgical mask will decrease the exposure by about 20%. So if we're starting in the unhealthy range, the background of this box is red for unhealthy. If we're starting in the unhealthy range, a medical mask will decrease your exposure, but probably still keep you in the unhealthy range, unless you were already right at the bottom. You might make it down into unhealthy for sensitive groups. Because a N95 respirator has a better fit and some slight differences in the filtration material, that'll actually decrease somebody's exposure roughly 80%. And so if it's an unhealthy day, it could bring you down into the moderate range. And for folks that have been fit tested, right, many of you probably have been fit tested because of working in clinical settings, that can decrease even further, more like 90 or 95%. And so that can bring you from the unhealthy range all the way back into the good range. There was a working group that made specific guidance for children and pregnant people. I can give you links in a second that'll take you to that. They're relatively safe. This is our, so pivoting from masks and respirators, just to wrap up, this is our wildfire page on the Western State PACU website. The QR code at the bottom there is our main webpage at wspacu.ucsf.edu. And this is our wildfire page. We've got a number of things on there, including a CE course for physicians, some posters and handouts and infographics to help teach folks about wildfire smoke exposure for kids and pregnant people. We also have Twitter. We have a YouTube channel with a variety of things. Lots of wildfire smoke stuff, a lot of material on other environmental exposures as well. There's some cool stuff out specifically aimed at kids. This is the CE course that I mentioned. And just to wrap up, which I realize we're like right at time. Sorry, I was trying to leave some time. Kids are uniquely vulnerable because of changes in or differences in their physiology, continuing development, and because of behavioral differences that increase their exposure. The best described health effects for children right now in terms of wildfire smoke events are respiratory effects, but our knowledge about others is rapidly increasing. So I'd say stay tuned. Certainly some birth effects as well. And then some kinds of masks and respirators can be used to decrease children's exposure, but there's ongoing need for a lot of regulatory work to make those more accessible. And as I said, you can use fire.airnow.gov to look at the levels, and AQ Spec has info on low-cost sensors.